can be lonely at the top. We all know what it's like to lead and own a business and wanting to scale, but finding yourself at a glass ceiling. That is where the power of collaboration and connection comes in. Hi, I'm Natasha Milani. I'm an expert at helping businesses and business owners harness the power of collaboration to connect, scale and grow. I am passionate about collaboration. I believe that no one executes alone. We all do better when we do it together. Welcome to this Power of Collaboration podcast. It's wonderful to have you here. I hope you get the inspiration and information you need to harness the power of collaboration to break through your glass ceilings. Today, we're talking to Michael Masterson from Everedge and from New Zealand. Welcome.
Well, technically from Melbourne, via New Zealand.
Originally from Melbourne.
Yeah.
But just out of interest, you've come across from New Zealand today, and welcome to Adelaide.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to be back here. So it literally feels like my second home. So I love Adelaide.
Well, I love hearing you say that because we love having you here. So, Michael, let's just tell everyone a little bit about who is Michael, a bit of your background.
Yeah, accidental startup founder. Back in 1990, 6 of us essentially took a company from that to just under 8,000 people. So we scaled that from Melbourne in Carlton Square South. And it was just like being on a rocket ride that I didn't realise at the time because I just thought that was normal. I thought that's kind of what you did. And it really plays to what your opening was, Tash, in that it was all about collaboration. So, yeah, we were incredibly lucky. We developed this incredible culture that was just, at the time, I didn't quite appreciate it, even though, I'd kind of studied organisational psychology and, that was my plan. I was going to become an org psychologist and then join this startup by accident and never finished my my graduate diploma of applied psych, which was my second degree. I got halfway through that and took a leave of absence, which one day hopefully I'll get back and do. And yeah, for the next 14 years was traveling the world, growing that business. We got acquired by a company called Omnicom out in New York, which is a $40 billion company. And at 23, I was reporting to New York and I literally had no idea what I was doing. I still don't, just quietly. Don't tell anyone. And yeah, it's just been an absolute rocket ship of a ride. And did a couple of turnarounds, one in freight and logistics, another one in FMCG. Both companies, according to their numbers, looked great, but weren't. And, not just culturally, they were really struggling, but also it was the things that weren't in their financials that identified there was some pretty major problems. One was 6 weeks from running out of cash. And, I went from being someone who grew companies to all of a sudden having to turn around a company. And I can tell you, it's a completely different skill set. When you're growing a company, you often are generating, exponential amounts of revenue and profit. And it's really easy to create a great culture when you've got cash. But when you've got no cash and you're trying to save the company, it's really hard to keep it fun. So, I learnt some pretty clever ways of building that collaboration, which not just obviously at a senior exec level, but, the guys in the warehouse, getting them actually working together and understanding, why do I come to work? Why do I work hard rather than just slacking off? And that ultimately comes down to collaboration. And it's having that sense of purpose and making sure that everyone understands what that is. And then, 30-odd scale-ups. I've done everything from healthy vending machines. We were one of the first promotional text messaging companies. We launched one of the first comparator websites for insurance and things. There's not much I haven't done. And I think that's probably part of my challenge is that, I don't like to say no to people. And that's now led, to me sitting on a number of private and public boards, including Cure Brain Cancer, which is just, a tremendous organisation, which I'm very lucky to be involved with. And then, Everedge, which again, when I joined, I think it was, 5 people. And we're now heading towards 50 and we don't really have a competitor globally. We get to work with some incredible clients, especially here in Adelaide. Everyone from people like Treasury Wines to Sage, to New Medico, Kelly Engineering, Seed Terminator, Fuse Tech. I mean, it just goes on. And that's one of the reasons, Adelaide's become kind of second home is that, thanks to people like yourself and many others who have been incredibly supportive and helping people understand the work we do, we've really been able to make some pretty amazing change. So here I am.
I mean, there's so much I'm going to unpack a bit more in that, but I'm pleased to hear you say that. I almost think fuel, if you don't know everything, I feel much better. That's great. There's so much more for us both to learn together
One
in
of
life.
one of the things I learnt, Tash, is working out your level of incompetence, and I was lucky enough to work that out very early. When you become CEO of a company at 23, and everyone's looking to you that have the answers, and you realise you have no answers. In fact, you're not even sure what the question is, and often you are making it up, but you're doing it instinctively. And one of the things I think I naturally did, and I remember, I call this a trick. It wasn't a trick. It was actually quite clever, is always ask your team what the answer is before you propose your answer. And the lesson behind that is if they've got a much better answer than you do, you shut up and use theirs and go with it. And if you happen to have a better one, then quite often you find it's accretive. In other words, you're building on what they've fed back to you. And that to me is, collaboration to me equals GSD, get shit done. Because you normally can't get shit done unless you're collaborating. I don't think there's many things you can do in life by yourself. Maybe if you're a 100-meter sprinter, yeah. But, even then, you need great coaches and advisors around you.
Absolutely. So now let's just talk about Everedge for a little bit in terms of Everedge being an intangible asset specialist. I love delving into this because street talk, we know what intangible assets are, don't we? Bit of IP, brand, etc. Can you just share what that means to you in the context of Everedge?
Yeah, I think we're getting better at helping not just other people understand what we do, but ourselves understand what we do. And I was talking to someone this morning, and you've really got to look at it in the literal sense. So we're not talking about the accounting treatment of intangible assets, which in many regards is bringing assets onto the balance sheet, writing them down, mostly for tax purposes. So it's an accounting treatment. We're not talking about that. We are taking the literal interpretation. So it's intangible, so it's non-physical. So you can't kick it with your toe. If you can kick it with your toe, we typically ignore that. So we're only looking at the things you can't kick with your toe. And the second aspect is assets. So what is an asset? And quite often the mistake we find people and companies and organisations make is they say, but it's not worth anything to me. But it could be worth something to someone else. And this was something that we worked with Treasury Wine on. They were about to do a deal with an early stage startup, and they really wanted Treasury's growing data. And of course, to Treasury, that's just operational data. It's not seen as valuable. And luckily enough, we got to meet Treasury, and they said, look, is this data valuable? And we said, yeah, it could be. So anyway, we valued it, but we valued it in the context of what it was worth to the external party. And it was really valuable, in fact, incredibly valuable. And so that changed the nature of the deal. So and what Treasury were able to do was incorporate the value of that into the negotiations with the external party. And, in Treasury's case, they told us that generated a 1,200% return on investment for them. So it's non-physical, and it's worth something either to you or, more importantly, to someone else. And so, therefore, intangible assets. We've been at this now for, 14 years. And the other thing, too, is that, you can kind of insert intangible assets for all of these other sayings. Secret sauce, Warren Buffett calls it an economic moat. Barriers to entry, lawyers call it IP, often accountants will call it goodwill. But ultimately what they're all trying to explain is how your business is going to generate a margin and attain a market share that's better than your competitors. That is ultimately what everyone is trying to do. And the reason they're trying to do that is because the strength of your intangible assets, and one of the ways I sort of like to think about it is think about individual intangible assets as being like your fingers. And so those intangible assets break down into 12 main categories. And it's things like, inventions, otherwise known as patents, data, systems, processes, knowledge, know-how, regulatory approvals, trade secrets, confidential information. So there's sort of, some of the main 12 buckets. And like fingers, they're individually quite weak. So, if I was to poke someone with my pinky, it will hurt me. But if I can bring all those fingers together, each of those intangible assets, and get them working together, now I've got fists. And as we saw in the boxing match on the weekend, just having two fists, that's not going to be enough to win the bout. You've got to learn how to box, both defend and also attack. And so that's really what we're trying to help, both early stage startups. Probably our smallest client is actually from Adelaide. Big shout out to Shem at Goldilocks. When we first met Shem, he was really, he had an idea at that point. He hadn't really even formed it into Goldilocks, all the way up to, Treasury Wine, one of the world's largest companies. So they've all got these things called intangibles. In fact, typically intangible assets account for at least 90% of the value of every single business. And as we've talked about, leaders is completely intangible. It's a brand, it's your network, your relationships, your knowledge, your know-how, the data that you form. They're your assets. You don't have any physical assets that are of realistic value. So we are now, the thought leaders in many regards on not just what these assets are, how to identify them, but also how to mitigate the risk around them. And unfortunately, the first issue we find, as we saw with Treasury, it's often inadvertent. People are giving away this stuff because they don't know it's valuable. And then ultimately it leads to how do you put a number on it that someone externally is prepared to pay you for it.
So for those listening, Michael, who run a business, own a business, manage a business, what I love is the lens that you really, maybe I'm being too simplistic here, so feel free to jump in, but there's the lens around intangible assets of maximising value or increasing value or finding value and minimising risk. Those two levers. You mentioned some great SA leader member companies earlier, Fuse Tech, Kelly Engineering, Sage. I imagine that they're two really important levers that can be pulled within those businesses.
Yeah, the analogy, I really like analogies. And for anyone who's ever driven a digger, in particular a bobcat, you need to use typically both hands and both feet. And one of the things that I always instinctively felt is that I always had the levers to my left. I had sales, go and hire some salespeople, sell whatever product or service that I was running, marketing, broadcast. Then I might have HR in terms of the kind of people HR could find me, finance, can I get, better cost of capital. And then, in the 80s, we finally got computers. I still remember that when I was at Ansett. And in the 90s, we got the internet. But you run out of levers really fast. And so if you think about intangible assets as being 12 levers to your right, so if you've got the traditional levers to your left, then you've got the 12 levers to your right. So they don't operate in isolation of the ones to the left. In fact, they operate very much in collaboration. Would you like the link?
Very nice. Well done.
Been working on that one all week. So it's about how you get those levers working together. And in particular, if you can train that organisation to understand, not just sales, but also marketing and your R&D people, how those 12 levers work to ultimately build value, then you're differentiating yourself from your competitors. It's a natural differentiation because you know stuff that your competitors don't. You know how to use different weapons, in that daily battle to go out and drive revenue and, keep your margins up and ultimately build that market share. But, ultimately your intangible assets are a proxy, not just for how much, margin and or market share you can generate, but obviously that's how you then generate a profit. And ultimately, it's your profit that enables you to then generate a return on that investment, either for you or for your investors. So coming back to the question around, risk and valuation, the first thing we say to any client is, well, just work out what your intangible assets are. Like literally start there. So anyone who's listening to this right now, just think about what are the top 3 things that you can't kick with your toe that could be of value to you or to someone else. And the lens I sort of suggest people use for this is, think about it from a burglar's point of view trying to break into a house. So, think about it. If you were your competitor, what are the 3 intangible assets that you would want to know or to be able to acquire that you've currently got? And that's your first 3 risks. Not only are they first 3 assets, but typically risks follows the assets. So for example, if it's a key trade secret or a key supplier that you've got that no one else knows about, then again, make sure you make it really hard for anyone else to find that out. And a bit like your house, there's an acceptable level of risk, but the first thing is you've got to do is understand that there is a risk and then work out whether that's acceptable. And that's why obviously, we have windows in our houses. Rather than, we live in these iron boxes because we're prepared to accept a risk that a burglar will smash a window to get into our house. So we might have this incredible lock on the front door, but the weakest point is the windows. So risk, though, is then linked to value, because if you can push risk down, then value comes up. But of course, if risk goes up, then value comes down. So if, let's say, you're going to sell your business and an acquirer can work out what your key trade secret is, or your formulation, or a key relationship that you've got, then they won't pay for what they can steal. So if they can work out a way to acquire those assets, and again, they are assets, then guess what? They're not going to pay you for them. And unfortunately, this pulls value down. So people will only pay for what they can't steal. And then the other classic mistake we find about value is that people often don't identify the right buyer. And the thing with intangible assets is that they're really unique in that, this microphone sitting in front of me, it's definitely not worth $1, but it's not worth $1 billion. And that's because it can't scale exponentially. This microphone can only be used 24/7. You can't use it any more than that. Yet the design and the knowledge and the know-how that's gone into microphone design, and you think about Rode microphones in particular, this is why Rode is such a successful company, is because they've been able to scale a number of elements around Rode microphones exponentially. They've been able to do some out-licensing, and they've got some material design that's really quite clever as well. So that's what then attracts them to a different kind of buyer. So in other words, intangible assets are always worth more in big hands than small hands. So you also want to find who's the right acquirer, either of all of your intangible assets, your business, or maybe it's a key particular singular intangible asset. So one of our clients, for example, developed a trade secret around how to weld stainless steel, and they could do it in 10% of the time that it took their competitors. So that's a 90% labour cost advantage that they had over their competitors. Now, obviously, they didn't want to license it to their competitors because they made more money out of selling their product and making the margin there. But we were able to license that to non-competing industries and also into markets our client was never going to go into. And interesting enough, that license now generates more profit than the rest of their organisation. So again, inside their business, it contributed a lot by, profitability, but outside, they were able to generate incremental revenue by licensing it out to non-competing industries.
So I just want to remind everyone listening that highlights the importance and opportunity of them taking away, list your 3 intangible assets that you can, as a starting point, the things that you can't touch and kick.
Yep.
It's really important because you just then look at them from a different lens, and you talk about risk. I mean, we talk about cyber risk and everything these days. How do you protect your secret sauce? If you can think about that post today's podcast, that's another key takeaway I'd like everyone to put on their action list.
Well, just on cyber, again, look, cyber is one of those terms that sort of grates on me because no one really knows. If I say cyber to 10 people, I'll get 10 different explanations. And, fun fact, it was actually developed by a guy called Neville Gibson. And Neville Gibson wrote a book in 1984 called Neuromancer. That was the first time cyber was defined. And it's just kind of adopted this persona of itself. But really, when you think about it, what a cyber criminal is trying to do is steal intangible assets. They're not stealing physical assets. They're stealing non-physical assets. So it's actually either intangible asset theft or digital asset theft or non-physical asset theft. And when one of the things I think people do is they overcomplicate most things. And that's one of the reasons why we pretty much try and stop our clients talking about IP. Because, I certainly understand what IP is, but, if you were to say to me, hey, Michael, SA Leaders has a whole bunch of IP, I genuinely don't know what you're talking about. I don't really know what you mean because it's just too vague. You've got to get, the more specific you can get about this stuff, the better the conversations you have. The better the conversations you have, the more meaningful they are, and they typically result in outcomes. And that, again, comes back to GSD, get shit done. And again, the best businesses that, I've been involved with and we work with now, it's their ability at a leadership level to be able to collaborate with their teams around them to actually get stuff done. And that often is that key point of differentiation, because if you can get something done faster than your competitors, you've got that natural advantage. You've got that speed to market. So
it should be easy to write down at 3. Probably the list would be a long list for many businesses.
Just start with 3. Because the thing is, once you've got those 3 assets, then you've, guess what, just worked out what the 3 risks are. But then what you can do is the third component is say, well, what could I do with these assets? Could I license them to someone that's non-competing? Could I do something differently? Is there a new market? Is there someone who maybe should acquire this asset from me and free up that cash, especially if it's an underutilized asset? So what it does is it starts using that part of your brain, remember those levers to the right, because typically we default to the levers on the left. Hire more salespeople, do more marketing, and that's not always the answer.
The 12 levers, can we actually go through the 12?
Yeah, sure. So no particular order, knowing
No
me, I'll
particular
forget one.
order.
So it's everything from invention, which is patents. So if you think about, you're inventing something, you're creating something. Now, more often than not, people think about them from a patent point of view because that's normally how you would protect those assets. Then you've got things like data. So, and that's not just, binary data, but it could be metadata, big data, customer data, might be insights. You've got confidential information and trade secrets. So in other words, how you do what you do, why you do what you do. Things like, the way you price things is quite critical there. Networks and relationships, who are the people to be able to get stuff done? And if you're doing a major contract and you know how to get to the right person, then that's a significant strategic advantage and also a time advantage, because quite often to get to the right decision maker takes a really, really long time. Certifications and regulatory approvals. So, if you're doing anything around medtech and you go into the US, again, you nearly always certainly will need FDA approval for your medical device or your pharmaceutical. So again, really, really critical. Then you've got one that most people don't know about called plant variety rights. So plant variety rights pertain to, you've come up with a new particular seed crop, or it might be a certain varietal on kiwi fruit or wheat or something like that. So they're sort of the main ones. And then actually probably the other big one that definitely deserves a mention is brand. Brand is one of those really interesting intangible assets that it starts off as being worth zero, but almost certainly and nearly always ends up being your most valuable asset. And you think about the day that Nike started. So Nike, the actual swoosh was designed by a student. But, the day Nike started, no one knew who it was. And now it's one of the most powerful brands in the world. Or the other one, which we all love, is Apple. The day that Jobs was, and the third guy, who I think sold his shares for $2,800, apparently doesn't regret it, but I find that hard to believe. Apple wasn't worth anything. Who would call a computer Apple? In fact, it was probably seen as a bit of a silly idea. But now it's probably the most powerful brand in the world. And, one of the newcomers to the brand race being Tesla. I think, what Tesla have done around their brand is phenomenal. Their market cap is now worth more than I think the three biggest car companies combined. And again, a lot of that comes down to brand. People don't say, did you go and buy a Model 3 or an S? They say, have you got a Tesla? So, these assets, again, individually are often quite weak. You think about Tesla without their software code, where you can't even turn the car on or even get into the car without the software code. And often the litmus test that we'll use with a client, and particularly if they can't go, oh, look, this stuff's interesting, but do I really need to worry about it? We just say, could you operate your company without one of those intangible assets? Could Tesla operate without software code? Absolutely not. Could they operate without those networks and those relationships that they've got with their supply chain? No. The production facility stops rapidly. Or without their brand, well, no one would probably buy a Tesla, but certainly they wouldn't pay the price premium that Tesla's able to convey for the product. So again, it's a really good test. If you want to see whether this stuff's valuable, just try not operating with your software code for a day or your CRM. And yeah, it's going to be a short day.
And you mentioned earlier you took a startup to 8,000 people and your background in organisational psychology, the culture, that's an intangible asset.
Yeah.
And also just share an insight into how what you've seen good examples of good culture might be that 8,000 people.
Yeah, well, look, it's something that I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit, obviously just to you. No one else is listening.
No one's listening, no.
But I never really thought about it, but pretty much every company that I'd ever either been involved with or run was intangible. And, we had desks, chairs, computers, but that wasn't the value. The reason we got to 8,000 people is because The culture is really a good way of encapsulating a lot of those intangible assets, a lot of those systems and processes and knowledge. We were really able to utilize that to have an attrition rate. Our industry, the attrition rate was 100% per annum. Ours was 2% per annum. We were 20%.
What industry was it? Cover that?
We literally created the concept of a contact center. So this wasn't telemarketing, but this was an actual contact center. And we were essentially born out of Ansett. So Ansett was our first client. In fact, I spent a number of years actually at Ansett. And we kind of took the whole idea of telemarketing or a reception or a reservation center and said, how do we essentially turn this into a career? And that was a really big thing back then because people didn't think it could be a career. And our clients were people like Ericsson, Telstra, Medibank Private. I mean, it was like a who's who list. And not only did we do the contact centers for these organizations like Flybys, I was literally there at the start of Flybys, when I think I was the fourth person to find out about it. But we also developed telephone-based account management. So we were managing, Ansett's and Ericsson and ExxonMobil's corporate accounts. Rather than having, a person, an account manager going out in their car on the road, we were doing that by phone. Now, again, that was a system. It was a process. It was knowledge. It was know-how. We were using the client's brand. We had incredibly well-trained people that were very professional. We protected that brand. So, we hired and ran all the door-to-door salespeople for people like Foxtel. And again, they were branded. They were those, the Taragos that you see driving around, with Foxtel on them, with 8 people in the car. And they would go out and literally knock on people's doors and say, hey, do you want to buy Foxtel? But again, it was very, very protective of the brand. So, that was a real rocket ride. And
you're talking about the culture.
Yeah, and I didn't realise until a few years ago I got to meet this incredible human being, a guy called Tony Say. And Tony created a brand called Zappos. And when I first met Tony, he was incredibly humble and, like, what do you do? And he said, I run a shoe company. And of course, I had no idea that Zappos was like, the biggest shoe company in the world, or online site for shoes. And we got chatting about holacracies. And I started to talk to him about what we'd built at Salesforce. And he's like, oh my God, I think you guys may have created the world's first holacracy. And we never thought about that at the time. We had an incredibly flat management structure. There were no bosses, everyone just kind of got along. We had this wild culture. We had parties that were just some of the most incredible experiences I've ever had, especially the toga parties and stuff.
I think we'll stop right there on that.
Yeah.
We don't want to know.
No. There's lots of people that can never talk about that. But what we did is that we really did build that family, and again, I come back to that word collaboration, in that everyone's kind of knew why they were there, whether you were answering the phone or you're in an executive role or an administration role, we all kind of had a common purpose. And, when Omnicom acquired us, that just took it to a whole next level because they enabled us to have the capital behind us. And, capitals are really key in any scale up. Mm-hmm. But capital follows not just growth, but also understanding. And I was talking to someone this morning and they were just saying, look, I don't understand how you can help me, explain to fund managers what we do. But the thing is that most people still make decisions 98% emotionally. You use 2% of logic to explain, to justify the 98% emotion. And what I was explaining is that if you're talking like every other scale-up company is about the same assets, the same balance sheet, the same P&L, the same growth rates, but you're not explaining what's actually driving and fueling that, then they don't really know what they're investing in. You're just another brand with another P&L. And yeah, your numbers might be slightly better, so maybe they'll go with you. But often it comes down to, and you often hear investors say, I back the jockey, not the horse. But, having had a bit to do with horses, if you look at a horse side on, it looks like it's got 2 legs. And you assume that the other 2 legs are on the same side. And we often see, in particular, investors doing this. They're only looking at it from the horse side on because they're really focused on the jockey. But as we know, if you walk around the other side of the horse, there might not be another 2 legs. And the thing I can assure you of is no two-legged horse is ever going to win a race. And so it's really critical to, again, understand what actually makes that horse what it is. And yeah, you need a great jockey. In fact, you need a whole bunch of things going right. And, typically a lot of luck. And, when we did Salesforce, we were in the right place at the right time with the right idea. And as a team, we executed brilliantly. And we learnt from our mistakes really, really fast. And we were making mistakes on a daily basis. And one of the things that made our culture incredibly special is that we really had this culture where failure was okay, as long as you didn't blow the company up in the process, because we were literally making stuff up on the fly. We were doing things that no one else was doing. We were putting cafes into our buildings, and we were taking old warehouses. You got to remember, this was 1990 that we were doing this. And I remember going to Google, and Google only started doing that stuff in the early 2000s. They were 10, 15 years behind us. And I never actually thought about that. So yeah, it was quite pioneering. But this nature of a holacracy, where everyone felt that they could contribute and that they had that voice, and more importantly, that we as the leadership team were listening and actually taking that on board and encouraging that culture of dissonance. We encourage people to say, hey, look, that's not right, or we can do better, or there's a better idea. And that's really hard, because I think a lot of people confuse management with leadership. And leadership is often doing the very unpopular things. Management's typically trying to find the popular, And one of the best definitions I've ever heard of innovation, or invention is probably even the better word, it's going where the crowd aren't, but are going to be. And, the best visual example, if you're in front of your computer right now, is go Google this. And it's crazy guy dancing at a music festival. Mm. And if you've seen it, it starts off with this guy dancing a bit like a bad version of Peter Garrett. And the people videoing him are really criticizing him. This guy's an idiot and he doesn't know what he's doing, how stupid, blah, blah, blah. And then next thing, this very large guy comes and starts dancing with him. And again, they're ridiculing him. Let's call him employee number one. And within, I think it's a minute and 40 seconds, there's 80 people I've counted in the video dancing with this guy. And what's funny is the people videoing it are now all of a sudden going, oh, wow, isn't this cool? And it's amazing. And that's like doing any sort of startup is. You start off being the crazy person. You convince someone else to be crazy with you. Then you convince more people to be crazy. And then next thing we had 8,000 people. And
that's collaboration. Positive and negative collaboration. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, look, positive collaboration. This sort of comes back to, I'm going to try and link this in, Natasha, to my psych degree. But, one of the things I learned in organizational psychology is that there's two kinds of stress. And we only think about one form of stress, which is distress. So we think about stress in the negative. It's things going wrong, putting pressure, the reason we don't sleep at night. But actually the thing that gets you out of the morning is this thing called eustress. And eustress is literally, it's motivation. It's the stress that causes that anxiety to get you out of bed and to function. And I think collaboration, maybe we should coin it as, you collaboration and discollaboration, because, you collaboration, EU collaboration, is where you are working collectively together. You've got a common goal and you're trying to get there. And often you're trying to create that holistic outcome, 1 + 1 = 3. It's a bit like, I was a sprinter in my teens. And as my coach used to point out to me, when you go up on your tippy toes and you lean forward, you actually have to move forward. You can't stay still in that position. It's impossible. And that's why sprinters always run on their toes, because you've got that forward momentum and you're always on an angle in that forward position. Whereas that discollaboration is typically when people are working against you, and sometimes it's through jealousy, it might be people, and unfortunately we do have tall poppy, and that can happen within an organization and also externally. And, quite often in organizations, people who don't buy into that collective vision can be quite destructive. And by the way, this can come about from boards. I've seen, unfortunately, a couple of boards that I got involved with were not collaborative at all. In fact, they were pretty horrible. And you've got to sort that out. It's very hard. It's like a three-legged stool. You can't function. You can't sit on it with only two legs operating. So this is where often you see in organisations, sometimes the CEO or the founder might not be the right person to take that organisation to the next level, and that's where it's got to transition. We certainly saw this with Uber, with Travis having to move on. Travis was a great founder, but he wasn't the guy to grow Uber. And I think that's often quite difficult for people to accept, that there is positive and there's negative collaboration. And you've certainly got to get not just the team in alignment with the leadership or the executive, but also with the board and also with the shareholders. And that's where it comes back to understanding what that common vision is. And again, I still love that term, culture of dissonance, where it's okay to disagree. In fact, you want to encourage it. You want people to feel like they've got that voice, because when you can give that organisation its voice, that's where it becomes super powerful. And that's where, I go back to the organisations I've been lucky to be involved with. And I look at Cure Brain Cancer at the moment, and we had an incredible CEO, Catherine Stace, who grew that organisation. And then we had a few hiccups. We couldn't get the three legs of the stool right. And we finally got that right with our current CEO, Lance, who is just a rock star. He's taken what Kath and Joe Quinn, our chair at the time, started, and we're now taking that to a global organisation. We've just launched GBM Agile, the first adaptive clinical trial in Australia, and this is stuff that's actually going to save lives. And it was a tough decision for us, because we decided to do that independently of government. And look, we could have taken the easy route and eventually got some government funding, but with way too many caveats. But we decided to kind of disrupt, but collaborated at a global level, which meant that we had to not collaborate at a local level. And that's where sometimes you've got to think about what's going to ultimately deliver that outcome. So that's kind of where we had, the positive collaboration working against the negative collaboration, as it were. And as an organisation or an individual, we've all got to make these decisions. And, they're not easy to make.
That's true. I often use the language, it's lonely at the top. And that's really why I enjoy doing this podcast, because it's about sharing these insights so that those listening can not feel alone. They can go, okay, well, this is actions I can take or tips in there, or I'm not the only one grappling with these challenges, so that I can share, learn and be vulnerable. And ask questions. And so that's what this podcast is really all about. Just in my one final question is, I just like to always make the most of asking, what book are you reading at the moment, or have you got a tip for a good book?
I'll give a tip for a good book. I am not very patient with reading. I'll always wait until the movie version comes out. But no, look, I think there's a couple of books that have really helped me on my journey. And look, for me to read a book, for
they
me,
must be good.
It's a
There's no movie?
big deal. Yeah, because I've got to be very patient to read a book, and they're all from different ends of the spectrum. So one of I think probably the most it was really around self-awareness, is by a guy called Lobsang Rampa, called Cave of the Ancients, and he talks about his journey on becoming a lama. So he's a Buddhist, and that really appealed to me from a spirituality point of view. And then on the complete opposite ends of the spectrum is Memos to the Chairman by Alan Greenberg, and about how he built Bear Stearns. And, to me, it's the secret guide to how to be a great CEO, because it teaches you all of the things that are the right things to do, and they're the common sense things to do, which often are not the things that people tell you to do. And then in between that, I would put The 7-Day Weekend by Ricardo Semler. And Ricardo took his family business in South America, which was not very big, and has turned it into one of the largest organizations in South America. And, one of the examples he uses is that he forbid doing tender processes, because by the time we write the tender, we issue the tender and we select whoever won, it's like a 18-month process. By that time, the problem's changed. So again, just what I call good old common sense, lateral thinking, just cuts the chase. But they're probably they're my three picks.
Perfect. Thank you very much to Michael Masterson from Everedge. We are so grateful to have you in the studio today and regularly visiting South Australia. So I know I can see the growth and the talent developing in some of our local businesses through your good work.
Thank you again. And I love Adelaide being my second home.
Thank you, Michael. At SA Leaders, we're all about collaboration and community. If you're curious to know more about how we help businesses and leaders just like you scale and grow beyond their glass ceilings, then visit our website at www.saleaders.com.au. And please don't forget to subscribe, share this podcast with your network, and write a review if you really enjoyed it. This has been an Audiosity production. I'm Natasha Milani, and I look forward to chatting with you next time. Happy connecting.